It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Live from the Green Space today, WNYC's street-facing theater in our building at 160 Varick Street. We have about 100 audience members who've come to watch us do the Brian Lehrer Show today. So welcome to all of you. Give yourselves a round of applause. So easy to get people to applaud for themselves. And they are all WNYC sustaining members, too, I understand. So we should all give them a round of applause. And thanks for your support. And welcome back to all our listeners on the radio and online this morning. And remember, folks, when we're in the green space, you can see the show as well as listen to it. We are live video streaming when we're in the green space. Find the stream at thegreenspace.org. That's green with an E at the end. thegreenspace.org for our live video stream, and we thank the Jerome L. Green Foundation for their eternal support for the Jerome L. Green Performance Space. Coming up live from the Green Space this morning, can developers' profits and affordable housing coexist? As part of our People's Guide to Power series, Real Estate Edition, we'll talk to a representative of for-profit and non-for-profit developers. How do you make money from affordable housing and still keep it affordable? Or where does enough money come from for affordable housing without the profit motive? Also this morning, something very special. This election day, one of your most important decisions, if you vote in New York State, will be yes or no to a state constitutional convention. Did you know this? Most people have not even heard of this yet. Progressives are divided. Some see opportunities, others see mostly risks. We will have a debate live on the Green Space stage in conjunction with the Intelligence Squared debate organizers, yes or no to a New York State constitutional convention. And what we want you to do, if you're listening right now and you have an opinion on this going into the debate today, yes or no on a New York State constitutional convention, if you've already heard anything about it and you have an opinion that you've been forming, we want you to go to the Intelligence Squared website now and vote on how you would vote. And then at the end of the debate, you're going to have an opportunity to vote again, and we're going to measure how many people's minds were changed in one direction or another. It's very interesting, these IQ squared debates, and it's one measure of public opinion. It's not a scientific sample, but it is a number of people who come in with an opinion on an issue. Do they go out with the same opinion? It's deliberative democracy in action. So go to iq2us.org/vote. That's the website. IQ2 for Intelligence Squared, IQ number 2 us.org/vote, IQ2us.org/vote, and cast that vote for how you would vote today on a constitutional convention for New York State, yes or no. We'll give you another opportunity to hear this before we actually start the debate later in the program, and then listen to inform your vote this election day on this question with potentially vast implications. Our first guests joining us right now, Claire Malone from 538. She is senior political writer for the website that does political and sports and other kinds of statistical analysis, 538. She's been writing lately about the 2018 midterm elections, which would change things a lot if the Democrats take control of either house or if the Republicans elect more Roy Moores. And just this morning, CNN has an article, Trump allies worry that losing the House means impeachment. Here was Steve Bannon over the weekend helping to roll the dice to promote more nationalist candidates like Roy Moore.
There's a time and season for everything. And right now, it's a season of war against a GOP establishment.
Hashtag war. So Claire Malone from 538 is with us. Some of Claire Malone's recent articles, 3 ways to look at Bob Corker's retirement, just as the Tennessee Republican is upping his game and calling Donald Trump a risk of starting World War III and someone in need of adult daycare. I'm sure you heard that. Also, how the GOP's identity crisis is shaking up some other Senate races. And on the other side of the aisle, why Democratic lion Dianne Feinstein may not be safe in her reelection next year. Also with us, Philip Bump, correspondent for The Washington Post, following the big national politics stories every day. Right now, one of the big stories is Trump undoing so many big Obama policies all at once. It seems the Clean Power Plant rules, DACA, Obamacare, cost-sharing subsidies for low-income insurance buyers, the Iran nuclear arms deal. The world is noticing Monday through Friday and on Saturday night. All right, we'll get that Saturday night clip eventually. Claire, one of your recent articles is 3 ways to read Senator Bob Corker's retirement. And again, Corker is the conservative Republican Tennessee senator who is now taken to questioning Trump's stability and competence. He used those words, stability and competence, accusing Trump, as I said, of threatening World War III in the way he's approaching North Korea and saying he needs adult daycare. That would seem to go with your scenario number 3, Corker's take 'em down with me mission.
Yeah.
Want to lay it out?
Kamikaze Corker. Yeah, I think that someone like Bob Corker, you know, there have been a series of GOP senators who have come in Trump's crosshair, and Bob Corker is sort of only the most recent. He spoke out pretty vocally after the Charlottesville events, and I think in general had sort of been looking at the political landscape, perhaps looking at someone like Jeff Flake in Arizona, who's facing a very stiff primary challenge from Kelly Ward. And I think Corker perhaps took a step back and thought, do I want to run for Senate again in this environment? And if I don't, what's the best course of action? He obviously doesn't like Trump personally. He was passed over to be Secretary of State and has sort of in incremental fashion been more vocal about his criticism of the president. So I think you might see someone like, you see McCain and Flake and Corker, they're all of a kind. And they're just, you know, Corker's only the most recent one in the news to sort of be this more establishment Republican speaking up against Trump.
By the way, I think now we can say, before we get too far from it, that people have been noticing all these things about the Obama legacy that Trump has been changing Monday through Friday and noticing on Saturday night.
It's been a big week, folks. We're getting rid of everything Obama did, healthcare, the Iran deal, and we're ripping out all the vegetables in Michelle Obama's garden and planting McNuggets. McNuggets. Love the McNuggets.
Alec Baldwin as Trump on Saturday Night Live. Philip Bump, what's with all this Obama policy undoing seeming to bunch up together? Is it a coincidence of when some various deadlines are, or is this how Trump is trying to energize his base right at this moment because he seems to be on a permanent crusade to energize his base?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the only people who really like him are his base, right? And so he keeps doing what he can to make them happy. I mean, I think it's important to remember that Donald Trump's political ideology was essentially formed by his paying attention to Fox News and paying attention to conservative media. He believes, I think, that all of these things were net negatives. He doesn't, I believe, and I think Bob Corker would probably agree, he doesn't have a particularly nuanced understanding of what Obamacare does, what its problems are, and what its successes are. And I think that what he's doing then is he has this sense that all these things are generally bad, and so he can do some things to undercut them, which he's doing. There's sort of been this tacit understanding that when a new president comes in, you don't rip everything out by the roots because it leads to some instability in the country. Donald Trump doesn't seem to be particularly beholden to that. And so what he's doing is he is doing what he can to undo the things that he thinks are bad, even while he may not totally understand what the long-term implications may be.
And Claire, your scenario number 1 on why Corker is retiring right now and pairing it with all this really tough anti-Trump language, so tough compared to other Republicans. One is that this is the one that Bannon would like to see, the establishment collapse narrative, you call it. And here is Bannon one more time from a speech over the weekend to the so-called Values Voters Summit, seeming to take aim directly at Corker's insults.
You know, as Bob Corker has trashed the commander-in-chief of our armed forces while we have young men and women in harm's way, right? Well, he said he's leading them on a path to World War III, that he is not stable, that people have to keep him moderated, that it's an adult center, and they took the morning shift off. Why some U.S. senator in a position of that authority, for the first time in the history of our republic, has mocked and ridiculed a commander-in-chief when we have kids in the field?
Going right after Corker there.
He sure is.
That he would hope to bring about what you call the establishment collapse narrative. What's that?
Well, Bannon and a couple of super PACs, there's a PAC called the Great America Alliance, have sort of honed in on most GOP Senate seats that are up in 2018, and basically they're putting Trump, Bannon candidates in the field. So Marsha Blackburn, who's now stepped in Tennessee, is... I recommend the audience go watch her ad. It's actually a good political ad. She sort of says, I'm a gun-toting conservative and proud of it. She's currently a member of the House. But Bannon is supporting candidates who are stylistically Trumpian, is how I would put it. They don't all necessarily have, Steve Bannon's political views about trade, let's say. But he's asking candidates to run in places somewhere like Wyoming, which I don't think any of us thought of until a couple weeks ago as a place that would maybe be a primary challenge in play. He's asking Eric Prince of Blackwater to take a look. And so there are places all over the country where Bannon says, hey, we've got a moment. Maybe these candidates that were seen as fringe even a year ago could really make hay in 2018.
And Philip, what's your sense of the impact of Corker going so hard against Trump and announcing his retirement at the same time, his impact on Trump's power with other Republicans in the Senate, and his impact on the fate of the Senate 2018? He certainly has the Bannon wing energized for a backlash, as we hear.
Yeah, I mean, Bob Corker was in a pretty common position among Republican establishment members last year, which is that he wanted to support his party's candidate. He felt as though he could probably be corralled, that it wouldn't really be that bad, that eventually he got on board and wanted to support Trump. As Claire mentioned, things went south. And I think that he is seeing this as an opportunity to sort of make amends for what he had done. I think it's important we remember that he was supportive of Donald Trump last year. But I mean, the question that we have with Bob Corker and with a lot of these other races, with Bannon's whole theme of I'm going to get people elected, which let's bear in mind, he came on board Donald Trump late in the campaign. He came on board with Moore late in the campaign. He doesn't really have a track record of showing he can win races, although these PACs, of course, change the dynamic to some extent. But this is going to be a very conservative electorate. And so this is exactly the sort of electorate. We always see more conservative Republicans come out to vote than are part of the actual Republican population in a place during a Republican primary. So it's a more conservative electorate. They're going to be more amenable to this sort of to hell with the Republican establishment call to action, whatever it means. I mean, that Bannon is supporting Michael Grimm in Staten Island. I mean, he's not he's Trumpian only in the fact that he wants to beat people up, right? I mean, this is, the Bannon doesn't, to Claire's point, doesn't have a consistent ideology, but this moment is the right moment. It is people are fired up, people are excited about Donald Trump, and more conservatives are going to come out next year, and that's scary to all the establishment.
For people who don't know that reference, Michael Grimm, I guess when he was previously the congressman from Staten Island, threatened to beat up New York One reporter Michael Scotto.
That's right.
And he's got other things like, did he get convicted?
He was,
he was also in jail. That's the second mention on the list. He's also
not of such great significance to Steve Bannon, I guess.
Right.
Now, those of you here in the green space, if you have a question about these kinds of national politics things that we're talking about right now, or a brief comment, raise your hand. We have a microphone that'll come around. We have a person who will come around with a microphone to give human beings who work here their credit. And listeners at home, or those of you watching us on the video stream at thegreenspace.org, you can call in 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. And we're going to go to a caller right now who I think has a pertinent question to what we were just talking about. No, not Michael Grimm, before that. Sharon in Manhattan, you're on WNYC. Hi, Sharon. Thank you for calling.
Good morning. Thank you very much for taking the call. I would like to know why the premise for discussion of Trump's possibility of getting any legislation across always has to be about his base. They don't represent most of Americans, and yet still people talk about the base. He's doing this for his base. Well, they're certainly not everybody, and they're not even the majority. Everybody says it's 30-something%. Well, where are the rest of the 50-something% of us, and why is it always about what he's doing for his base?
Great question. Thank you very much. And I think, Philip, you were starting to indicate before that it's because that's all he's got right now, becoming so unpopular in most of the country. And so, you know, in business, if you can't attract new customers, you tend to try to get your same customers to buy more of your products or buy your product more times.
Recurring pledges, if you will. Right. No, I mean, I think the important thing to remember is that
sustaining.
Donald Trump seems psychologically incapable of reaching across the aisle. I mean, like, quite literally, he doesn't seem to be able to have it within him to reach out to Democrats, to reach out to people who didn't vote for him. He has this base of support. He loves them. They got him. I mean, essentially, just a quick history is in order here. He came out hard on immigration. He built up a huge base of support really quickly, right? In a 17-person field that was critical. That helped power him to the nomination. That helped power him to the presidency. He feels very loyal to them. And he doesn't feel any obligation to reach out to people across the aisle. The reason we keep talking about his base is because that's all that he's doing, is he's focusing on the base. And so we say he's focusing on the base because he's only focusing on the base. But there's a reason that he does it. And I think that it is, at some point, if he doesn't figure out how he is actually going to, you know, do things like say, hey, California, sorry, you're burning up, right? Things like that, little measures like that are significant, but he refuses to do it. And I think that tells us a lot about his presidency, and that also helps explain why he's doing the things he's doing.
Claire, do you have anything to add to this as a data watcher at 538? I mean, I wonder about the same question frequently that Sharon is asking, but then I see reports that seem to contradict this idea that Trump is so isolated, because you get all these potential primaries for open Republican Senate seats or even Republican senators running for re-election that seems to indicate that the base may be 30% or so of the electorate as a whole, but they've got a lot of, they've got majorities, voting majorities in many of the red states.
Yeah. So I think, Philip is right about midterm elections where the electorate is more conservative. Trump's base is older and white, and those are voters who come out and vote. So in some ways, it's not a silly strategy for him to keep the base happy.
So it might be 30% of the country, but it might be more than 30% of the electorate.
Correct. So sometimes when you look at polls, you want to look at not just American adults, but American voting adults, basically. That's one thing.
And that's how he got elected president.
That is. But I think one useful thing to keep in mind is beyond the midterms, perhaps, for why Trump won the election. He certainly won because he had his base, but he also won because he had, let's call them, do you guys remember Georgia 6th? He had Georgia 6 Republicans. So those are wealthier suburban voters who said, oh, listen, I don't want to vote for the Democrat. I'm going to hold my nose and vote for this guy. In some ways, if Trump wants to sustain a second term, he needs to win over those people, keep them charmed. So it's not just about the base. I mean, some of this is intentional about just keeping sort of a vibrating wire, for the next 4 years or whatever it is.
And I know you've been reporting on the Senate more of late, but how about the CNN story that I referenced before? Trump allies worry that losing the House means impeachment. And the backdrop, I think, is a Cook Political Report survey that finds the Democrats with a slightly better than even chance of taking back the House, not the Senate, but the House. Does 538 have any handicapping along those lines yet?
Far be it from me to speak for the institution. But I think the Cook report that came out last week shows 45 competitive races. I think that's correct. And if the Democrats want to take the House, they need to win 33 of those. That's actually a push, I would say.
That's a lot.
And so I think Republicans have quite a lot of reasons to be optimistic, but also thinking about, if, let's say these indivisible groups that you see popping up, people refer to them as sort of the liberal Tea Party, will those actually churn an electoral advantage? The Tea Party was very effective in the midterms because, again, they had older white people activated, and those people are more likely than, let's say, younger people and minorities who maybe are riled up by Donald Trump's term in office. I think people are really waiting to see whether or not Democrats can turn some of this protest momentum into actual electoral advantage. And I still think that it's quite a lot of seats for the Democrats to win. So in some ways, the Republicans should be very conscious that impeachment is a big possibility if they lose the House, but they're in a decent position.
Because the House votes to impeach, which means force a president to stand trial in the Senate, for those who don't know. So who controls the House matters as the Mueller investigation results come in, and maybe other impeachment risks. Philip?
I would just note that that's absolutely correct, but I think that we sort of enter a weird period after the primaries next year. Obviously, every person in the House is up for re-election next year. They all face primaries, or a lot of them will face primaries. After that, it becomes a wild card. If Donald Trump has done something that is particularly egregious, that people are overwhelmingly speaking out about, and people are worried, in moderate-leaning districts, if people are worried about getting reelected, there may be a bigger push then. I mean, people forget that when Richard Nixon was impeached was actually after, the summer right before the midterm elections in 1974. That was when the talk of impeachment really grew, because I think we could potentially see something similar next year once the primaries are out of the way.
Philip, can you explain some things about the two big moves of the last few days by the president on Obamacare and the Iran deal? On Iran, he decertified the agreement, but that doesn't mean the U.S. is withdrawing. Can you unpack that in plain English?
Right. Well, I mean, that's really the best summary, is that essentially, he understands that he can't simply withdraw from the pact without massive repercussions. So essentially what he did is he tried to kick it back to Congress. By doing decertification, Congress now has to determine whether or not this is something we're going to stick to. He's done this with some regularity, tried to kick things to Congress, because he likes to use Congress as a foil to some good effect. Obviously, he came into office saying, I'm going to repeal Obamacare on day one, and then after it didn't happen, he blames the Republican Senate all the time, and he blames Congress for that as well. I think that this is, to the point you made earlier, to some extent, this is the moderating effect of others in the White House on Donald Trump. I think that if Donald Trump had his way, he would undo everything right away, to the extent that he could. And the Post actually has a good story this morning about all the ways in which people try and guide him to where they hope he will go. It's almost like an adult daycare, if you will. No, that's not right. But that is the headline of our piece, so I feel comfortable in saying that.
And that is what Corker meant, right?
Yeah,
the White House Chief of Staff, the Secretary of State, others. No, we don't want to really do that.
Let's wait a week and see how you feel about it, that sort of thing.
Right. Did we have a question here in the green space? Did I see the microphone was moving in Amina's hands to somebody? There the person is. Hi.
Hi. Excuse me. I'm wondering if any of you could articulate how you see the Bannon-Trump values. And we can think of the values on the Democratic side as fairness, protection of public lands, equal access to education, employment, etc. But when Bannon says destruction of the administrative state, that just means like eradication of government. And how would you understand that, and how would you suggest that the base understands those as overarching values?
Phil, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. I think it's somewhat of a mistake to attribute to Steve Bannon a consistent ideology, right? I mean, I'm not joking.
Really?
His ideology is immigrants are bad, that, we should keep work in America through some vague means that doesn't somehow destroy the global economy. I mean, he has this very negative perception of how America works as a partner on the world stage, and that is, I think, to the extent to which he cares about things. But then he couples that with his showmanship, right? I mean, he ran Breitbart. He got Breitbart pointed in all sorts of interesting directions, to use a sort of moderated word there, over the course of the campaign, even before he joined the Trump team. And so I think to the extent that he has an ideology, it is that things are bad as they are, and we should change, in particular, how America interacts on the global stage and who America lets in.
And on Obamacare, undoing these cost-sharing subsidies for certain insurance policy buyers, maybe the first thing to say is don't panic if you're affected, because this doesn't take effect until 2019. Is that accurate?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting political move from the standpoint of it sets you up for 2020. But yeah, these are subsidies that go to insurers so that they will provide better coverage to lower income people. Basically, it means that they're going to have to raise their premiums so they can make up the cost that they were getting from the government. So it affects the deficit hugely in a negative way, but it's something that Trump wanted to do.
And Claire, I heard this morning that those cost-sharing subsidies go disproportionately to people in Trump voting states in the 2016 election. So there's some political risk there.
Certainly, yeah. But I think to the audience member's question, people are a lot more forgiving of the Bannon-Trump ideology in some ways, because I think what we're experiencing now is sort of the financial crisis coming home to roost. So I think the groundwork was laid for an incredible distrust of American systems and businesses, and not incorrectly. I think people saw that a lot of people in the banking world were not punished with prison time. And there's a certain amount of, I think, vindictiveness and righteous anger in the American base in a lot of places, and American voters in a lot of places saying, well, I'm still feeling the effects, and I think there's a lot more radicalism among the voting base.
But they're not taking it out. I mean, that on paper is part of Steve Bannon's worldview, but they're not taking it out on Wall Street. They're taking it out on immigrants, right? I mean, they want to unleash Wall Street from parts of Dodd-Frank, this big tax cut for the rich that's being floated now. It's like they're looking away from all that, and they're focusing on what they see as the economic and cultural threat from allowing a lot of people of color into the United States.
I think that's because the United States is now, everyone knows this, it's a very partisan political environment right now, and you root for your team. And right now, those are the Republicans' policy goals, but the Republicans are also vocalizing and, let's say, marketing, having a good PR campaign to voice the anger that a lot of people feel. A lot of people, don't know the policy agenda, and I don't think that that's any dig about the intellect of the American public. It's just that people have a lot of stuff going on, and you sort of vote. It's a cultural, pheromonal, however we want to say it. You go with the guy that you think, it's with your gut. It's kind of like dating, right? You're kind of saying, this person seems to share my values. Right. And that's really true how a lot of politicians make hay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's an element to this as well, which is that immigrants are a traditional historic foil, right? And that by pointing to immigrants as being bad and being the ones that are hurting the economy, this is a long-standing tactic. This is something that Steve Bannon and Breitbart had embraced last year as well. It's not an accident that they're being focused on, of course. I mean, there's this story in the New Yorker that just was published where Stephen Miller, who's the senior advisor to Donald Trump, he used to be friends with Richard Spencer, the white nationalist from Charlottesville, when they were in college. But Miller, essentially, the president had asked for a report on the economic effects of refugees. And so I believe it was HHS came back and said, yes, refugees actually add X billion dollars to the economy. And Stephen Miller's like, why don't you take another look at those numbers, right? And that's obviously not how it's supposed to work, but immigrants are a critical foil, and they are, as I said earlier, they are why Donald Trump, I think, was able to be successful over the course of the primaries by using them in that way.
And by the way, Claire, you mentioned the intelligence of the American voters. It's interesting, this meme with the word moron that seems to have broken out. And I think it actually started when Steve Bannon, campaigning for Roy Moore in Alabama, whipped up the crowd by saying, they, meaning the liberal elite, think you're morons. And then we heard, and I wonder if it was in response to that, that Secretary of State Tillerson privately called Donald Trump
I think
a
Tillerson.
moron.
I think
You think Tillerson came first?
I think Tillerson came first, and the news broke later. But perhaps simpatico thoughts of, I don't know. But yeah, there's certainly it's like the deplorables with Clinton. There was sort of a re-owning of that phrase.
And then it came out, the woman who leads the organization that won the Nobel Peace Prize last Friday, she had tweeted 2 days earlier in response to the, what do you mean he called Trump a moron? She tweeted, Trump is a moron. So there's a lot of high-level moron calling going on here. Bannon and Tillerson and the Nobel Peace Prize winner for 2017. Claire, this Obamacare thing is an executive action because the Republican Senate has failed to pass an Obamacare repeal bill, obviously. Yeah. How does this time bomb the president just threw in there for 2019 potentially affect the elections in 2018?
Well, I think it is notable, as you said earlier, that it doesn't go into effect until after the midterm elections, and that's something that voters might.
Although I should say that based on that, as I understand the way Obamacare works, the insurance companies before Election Day next year will announce their rate hikes.
Right, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if the rate hikes are much bigger, as is predicted, based on the elimination of these cost-sharing subsidies, people are going to know.
Yeah. I do think healthcare in general, Trump probably wanted to take some sort of action, a death by 1,000 cuts kind of action, because a lot of donors, GOP donors, are very upset that there has been no healthcare legislation that's gone through. I believe they saw a big dip in not just in small donor dollars, but also big donor funds right after the last failure of the healthcare bill. So in some ways, this is a political imperative for Republicans. I think they see it as that, as for the 2018 midterms.
We have 30 seconds left. Claire, you're going to get the last word. We didn't get into Dianne Feinstein possibly having her seat threatened. That's to some degree from within her own party, from the progressive movement within the Democratic Party that's finding her too establishment in her own right from a Democratic standpoint? Are we going to see, like, Bannon nationalists all over the Republican primaries? Are we going to see Bernie progressives all over the Democratic primaries?
You might. I mean, Feinstein is an interesting example because she's a lot more conservative than the California base. I'd say it's a little bit open season in both parties, although the Democrats might have a little bit more of a practical need to rally behind their flag, although Feinstein is, I think, in for an interesting race this year.
Claire Malone, senior political writer for 538. Philip Bump, Washington Post correspondent. Please thank them, everybody. Thank you very much. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. We continue live from the green space in a minute.
On the next Fresh Air, new research about sleep, research that might keep you up at night. Matthew Walker, author of Why We Sleep, tells us why we need 8 hours, the alarming consequences of the lack of it, and what's going on in the brain when we sleep.
During some stages of sleep, the brain is up to 30% more active than when we're awake.
And he'll give us some tips on how to get a good night's rest. Join us.
Today at 2 on 93.9 FM WNYC.
Support for WNYC comes from the Vital Projects Fund in the Museum of Modern Art, where the major exhibition Items is Fashion Modern is now on view, and the museum is open late on Fridays and Saturdays until 9 p.m. through December 30th. More info and tickets at MoMA.org. Purchase College SUNY, presenting Paul Beatty, author of The Sellout, in a public conversation as part of the Durst Distinguished Lecture Series, October 17th at 4:30 p.m. in the Humanities Theater. More at purchase.edu. The New York City Transitional Finance Authority, which is offering future tax-secured bonds to individual investors on Monday, October 16th and Tuesday, October 17th. The preliminary official circular and more information are available through financial advisors and broker-dealers.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live from the green space today, and we have filled the green space audience for today's show with WNYC sustaining members. Our fall pledge drive starts tomorrow, and we're kicking things off with a big challenge. By 7 o'clock tomorrow night, we need to get 1,500 people to become sustaining members. If we do that, we'll unlock a $100,000 matching gift from one of our board members. We're getting a head start on the challenge today. I'm not going to mention it over and over again like a pledge drive day, so we're just saying right now we invite you, and we hope you will call 888-376-WNYC, 888-376-9692, or go to WNYC.org to make your sustaining gift right now. That means instead of one lump sum, we just take 1/12 of that from your credit card each month. That's all a sustaining membership is. And if we get 1,500 people to do that by 7 o'clock tomorrow, one of our board members will give us an extra $100,000 for showing that we have a lot of public support. Also, quick program note, WNYC will air the New York City Public Advocate debate tonight from 7 to 8 o'clock on 93.9 FM and AM 820. I will be moderating that debate along with Errol Lewis from New York One, the New York City Public Advocate Letitia James, the Democratic incumbent, versus the Republican challenger J.C. Polanco. Errol Lewis and I moderating the Public Advocate debate live here tonight on WNYC at 7 o'clock. Now we continue our October series, A People's Guide to Power, Real Estate Edition. With elections coming up in New York and New Jersey, we're asking what unbalanced power relationships make housing so unaffordable in greater New York, decade after decade, or at least contribute to that, even as every New York mayor announces historic affordable housing programs, and every New Jersey governor comes with a plan to get property taxes under control. We're doing segments on these things throughout the month of October here on The Brian Lehrer Show, A People's Guide to Power, Real Estate Edition. Jessica Gould from the WNYC News team has been digging around on the question and discovered a few things, and she is here now. Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
Along with a major player in the industry, Jolie Milstein, President and CEO of the New York State Association for Affordable Housing. This is the trade association that represents developers who build affordable housing, both for-profit and not-for-profit developers. Deputy Mayor Alicia Glenn told us Friday that 2/3 of what they call affordable housing is being built by for-profit developers, about 1/3 by not-for-profits, and that ratio is controversial. The not-for-profits and some affordable housing advocates say the for-profit developers skew affordable housing construction toward the higher end of the subsidized income range, leaving the most housing-needy New Yorkers behind, and that the net effect of for-profit development, even with some affordable units included, is gentrification and the displacement of current residents that comes with it, neighborhood after neighborhood. So that's the critique. Let's hear what the top representative of the industry that represents both sectors, for-profit and not-for-profit, has to say. Ms. Milstein, thanks so much for coming in. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you very much. Long-time listener, happy to be here.
And first of all, how do you represent both the for-profit and not-for-profit affordable housing developers right now? They seem to be fairly pitted against each other at the moment.
It would seem that way from the press coverage, but in fact, what distinguishes developers isn't so much for-profit versus not-for-profit. I think it's more experience and net worth that really, real estate's a very capital-intensive business. I think that there are for-profit and not-for-profit developers. I was a not-for-profit developer before taking this job, so I speak from some experience. There's capable developers in for-profit and not-for-profit, and I don't think that's really what distinguishes developers, at least in New York City.
How many members does your group have, and how many in each sector?
We have about 350 members. We're a statewide organization, so I don't know the exact number of not-for-profit versus for-profit. It's different in New York City versus upstate, but we have a fairly robust representation of not-for-profit developers in both New York City and across the state.
And what's an acceptable margin for a for-profit developer to make? What's the minimum expectation for them to be willing to invest?
I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that both for-profit and not-for-profit developers respond to the programs that New York City offers to produce affordable housing in New York City with New York City subsidy or New York State subsidy. So what happens in the world of affordable housing in our city and our state is government offers subsidies and programs that target different incomes and have different parameters for underwriting, and developers respond to those RFPs. So it's really not something that's determined by the developer in terms of what the underwriting looks like. They do their best effort to respond in a competitive environment.
So no numbers to give? Like they would crunch it and say, oh, if we can't make a 6%, a 16% return on our investment, a 26%, whatever it is, then it's a no-go?
I think Jessica's talked to a number of developers who might be able to answer that question. I've never done that investigation of our for-profit or not-for-profit members. But again, the city's trying to encourage, there's a housing crisis. And so the city and the state and the federal government are all putting programs and money out there to try and address the crisis.
Sure. So what the developers need to see as a return in order to build is obviously a key factor that the city wants to take into account to encourage as much development as possible to ease the housing shortage. Jessica, what do you want to add?
So one thing I do want to say is a lot of the nonprofits that I've talked to are concerned about the way NYSAFA represents the for-profit. So while you do have, as you mentioned, membership that includes both, I think it's only fair to reflect the fact that there are a lot of nonprofits who feel like your membership skews more for-profit and advocates on behalf of that industry, and they're concerned about losing a market share of the development to the for-profits. And as Alicia Glenn said last week, 2/3 or 2/3 plus of the development is going to these for-profits. And I just want to underscore what the larger question here is, which is the development of affordable housing has become kind of the centerpiece of the debate about affordable housing. So everybody lauds the goal that the mayor has about building more affordable housing. The question that has been asked and is being asked loudly at hearings and at community boards is this affordable housing affordable enough for the people who live in the neighborhoods now to stay in the neighborhoods? The de Blasio administration says that they need to construct more, and they're trying to address that problem, but some people criticize them as accelerating it. So in answer to the question, I believe that the development fee is between 10% and 15% of the project cost, which can add up to tens of millions of dollars. And the argument that the nonprofits have made to me is that they often, and more often, put that money back into the project to lower the threshold for how affordable it is so that more people can afford it at the lowest income levels. Whereas the developers who are for-profit, understandably, to support their business model, take that and it's their profit. So that's the debate that is going on. And it may seem technical, but it's really about how affordable the affordable housing is.
And do I understand you have a clip of somebody who represents the nonprofit sector or an activist group that wants to encourage the nonprofit sector?
Right. Well, Jonathan Weston represents New York Communities for Change. I know Jolie and Jonathan
don't always see eye
to eye. But his concern is about how affordable the affordable housing constructed by these for-profit developers is.
NYSAFA claims to be building affordable housing, but in reality, a lot of the projects they do are majority luxury housing, and the affordable housing that they develop in communities is unaffordable for the neighborhoods that they place them in, thereby gentrifying the communities where they are developing.
And my guest on stage is Jolie Milstein, President and CEO of NYSAFA, or the New York State Association for Affordable Housing, along with WNYC development reporter Jessica Gould. Ms. Milstein, what's your response to that speaker and the arguments that Jessica was laying out from those advocates generally?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I can understand why that would be a concern for people, and I don't agree that most of our developers build a preponderance of luxury housing. That's just not who our members are. I believe that most of our developers are responding, other than the 421A redo, which is a separate program. We're not really focusing on that here. But
a certain kind of tax subsidy.
Which is a tax subsidy that encourages the creation of affordable housing along with market rate housing as a cross subsidy to just increase the supply. Again, we're in a housing crisis. Our developers, both not-for-profit and for-profit, are responding to the programs that the city, state, and federal government decide upon. So when you respond to be in a competitive pool to develop these projects, you're not getting to decide who lives there and what incomes. That's something that the program describes for you when you respond to that. Having been a not-for-profit developer, I don't understand when people say they're putting their fees back in to make it more affordable. That's not how the underwriting works in my experience. I think people who are in a not-for-profit environment tend to be mission-driven, and at least in our case, some of the developer fees go to supporting the mission of the organization. But really, the underwriting is not something that a developer, for-profit or not-for-profit, is really driving. Those are program pieces that the city or the funding source describes for you.
So I would say that, first of all, the city articulates a similar position that you have, which is that it's an affordable housing crisis. We need all resources marshaled to address it. So for-profit and nonprofit. Mm-hmm. And that there are good nonprofits and there are not as good nonprofits, and there are good for-profits and not as good, and that they're deciding on the merits. There is a report that an organization called ANHD is releasing today that shows that at least in the first 2.5 years of the de Blasio administration, which includes some, I believe, Bloomberg-era projects, the lowest income housing was built more by nonprofits than for-profits. But I think what also is at play here is a discomfort that a lot of New Yorkers are feeling with the idea that at a time when homelessness is spiking and the affordable housing crisis is so deeply felt by everyone in this city, that there are people who are making money, and in some cases a good amount of money, from this industry.
Well, I think that NYSAFA is on the threshold of launching a whole campaign to build awareness about what the housing crisis looks like, because I think unless you understand that half of the renters in this city, in fact across the country, are rent burdened, and I think it's almost a third pay more than half their income in rent, you understand then that this is a problem across the city and not just for the very lowest income, although that is important, and I used to work addressing specifically that issue. The mayor's just put another $1.7 billion of capital into addressing the very lowest income. Unlike many places across the country, we have a program targeting just, Ella, the very lowest income. So I think the administration is aggressively addressing that. But you can't ignore the working people who also can't afford to live in this city. And if you don't build mixed income projects across the city, you're going to continue to concentrate poverty. And I just also want to point out that we believe building these mixed income projects expands the pie, that we're not redistributing, we're really expanding housing at all income levels of affordability. And that's very important to making sure we don't hollow out the city. If school teachers, firefighters, people who work in hospitals, people that work all throughout the service industry in New York City can't afford to live here, which is happening very aggressively and accelerating, we're going to have a much larger problem. Concentration of poverty is not what we want.
Audience here in the green space, if anybody has a question, you can raise your hand. Listeners on the radio or people watching the video stream at thegreenspace.org, you can call up 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. Did I see a hand up over here? Okay, right there. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Susan. I guess there's something that seems a little, I don't know, unreal about not seeing how the current mix of housing that's being built would not lead to gentrification. I mean, maybe I need more specifics, but if I believe it's 2/3 are going in at market rate, those are people with a lot of money, and it just leads to different types of stores and different types of, how would that not change a neighborhood?
And to put a little finer point on, or additional point on that, if the mayor's mandatory inclusionary zoning pertains mostly to getting higher, more dense buildings approved, and frequently it's 25-30% affordable for 70-75% market rate, if most units in a development are market rate, then doesn't the neighborhood simply become more unaffordable on balance than it was the day before, to the audience member's question?
I think what the audience member, Susan, right? Thank you for the question, and I think that's an excellent question. And I think that question is really addressing the redo of 421A, which is not the programs that's really more a real estate board of New York issue, because that's a different segment of developers that are building that. That's not what our members typically are building. We're building projects that are mostly 100% affordable housing. And that other tool that uses density and an increase in density to try and bring some affordable housing, if we didn't have that happening, what would happen is you'd probably get the 70% of market rate housing and no affordable housing. Because the choice there is developers building all market rate or getting to build a little bit more market rate and substantial amount of affordable. But again, that's not the programs that we're here to talk about today, because that's not, or at least not with me, because that's not my area of expertise.
Because the rezoning, and Jessica, I think this is a frustration for a lot of people and something people don't understand. The rezoning only applies to buildings that people own that they want to build higher on than they're able to build today, and that's when the city has some leverage to ask for any percentage at all. If that was not in place, then all the units that currently exist there could go to market rate, right?
I believe that we are talking about the rezoned areas and also the housing that is subsidized by the city right now. Is that right?
I'm sorry.
So there's affordable housing being built in all these different ways. Rezoning is one of them. Then there's city subsidies and federal subsidies that go into affordable housing projects. And the de Blasio administration's 78,000 units built and preserved so far towards 200,000 units is what we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a call right now. We're going to go to line 3. Jordan in Greenpoint. You're on WNYC. Hi, Jordan. Thanks for calling in.
Hi. Thanks for having me on.
What's your question?
It's more a comment, really, but I just wanted to comment on what I feel is a bit of a hopeless situation. I'm a bit of a pessimist about it. I'm a real estate agent in North Brooklyn, and from what I see, from my perspective, the developers are really not working if they're not pulling, a minimum of 25% net. The amount of money that they have grown accustomed to making is simply enormous, and they have gotten the momentum and the leverage to basically, ensure that this is their rate, or they won't work, and it's a bit of a catch-22 as I see, or better yet, a feedback loop. They're not doing the work if they're not making an extreme amount of money. And it seems like the market just seems to carry this inertia forward. And I also want to make another comment real quick. I'm going to sneak it in. What is luxury housing anymore? What are we defining as luxury housing? Because I'm in these condos all the time.
What do you define it as?
That's a discussion.
As a real estate agent, what do you define it as?
I'm honestly not sure. It's become a meaningless term to me. What I see called luxury housing is an apartment with a bedroom and a living room and a dishwasher. And
the living room is a luxury these days. It's true.
I think we need to keep an eye on where that goal line is and where it's moving and where it's moved from. Because we're talking about luxury housing versus non-luxury housing. And no offense to any of you, but all I'm hearing is gibberish because it's a meaningless term at this point when a penthouse with, 1,500 square feet of outdoor space is luxury housing and a 550 square foot one bedroom apartment that has a washer and dryer in the unit and I don't know.
Well, if luxury housing, even if it's that simple an apartment, it's only affordable to the top relatively few percent of New Yorkers, right?
From what I see, absolutely. I mean, I'm in North Brooklyn. I'm in the belly of the beast, and a bit of, Bushwick, Bed-Stuy, and now I'm seeing it in Ridgewood. But, there's, listen, we'll sell a closet with a dirt floor for $400,000. So, you tell me.
Thank you for lifting the veil on some of that. We appreciate it.
I think it's an important moment to talk, maybe defining terms, because at least, and I'm not going to go to describing what's luxury in New York City especially, but I think when we talk about affordable housing, at least in the context of New York City and New York State, which is where we work, affordable housing is housing that's built through government program, either direct subsidy or some indirect subsidy, and comes with restricted rents. So you have to income qualify to live in those units. So as differentiated from market rate housing, which may have some tax abatement, may have some government involvement, but that doesn't cross the threshold of then needing residents to income qualify. And I just want to make sure we're all talking about the same thing when we talk about affordable housing.
But there's a range within that, and I have it in front of me. It's always helpful for me to look at what we're talking about specifically. And the range of what constitutes affordable housing is for a family of three that makes less than $25,000 a year, $25,770, up to a family of three that makes $142,000 a year. And those are all the income bands that are considered affordable under the mayor's housing plan. The most units that are being built right now are almost 50% up until this summer. And I think there's more that are being targeted towards the lowest income. Mm-hmm. But up until this summer, it was between $43,000 a year for a family of three and $69,000 a year, which is, as I've talked about before, it's a teacher supporting two kids or something like that.
And Jessica and I are going to continue this on tomorrow's show with another guest joining us. But in our last 2 minutes for now, Ms. Milstein, to the stats that Jessica just gave, the argument that the advocates make is that the for-profit developers, because they need this 15%, 25%, whatever it is off the top, are more geared to building the higher end affordable housing than the lower end affordable housing. And Last thing, an article in Cranes in June said the city does not give any special preference to small nonprofit developers for being connected to communities or focusing on buildings for very poor tenants. So I'm just curious, since you represent both sectors, on behalf of your not-for-profit members connected to communities and specializing in low income, shouldn't the city do that?
Well, the city may not directly recognize that, but in almost any community today, as you read about in the papers, it's very difficult to construct anything in most neighborhoods of New York without being tied to the community. So I think increasingly, even our for-profit members are joint venturing with our not-for-profit members and other community groups, because you really, if you're not already in that neighborhood where you're targeting a development opportunity, you need to be tied to in some way, because we create local jobs. You know, affordable housing isn't only about creating the housing. It throws off a lot of economic development opportunity, and we're investing in neighborhoods. So I think you're seeing more and more joint ventures and really more partnerships, and I think we're seeing more cohesion across the industry.
Jolie Milstein, President and CEO of the New York State Association for Affordable Housing, which represents for-profit and not-for-profit developers of affordable housing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
WNYC's Jessica Gould will continue on the topic tomorrow in our series, A People's Guide to Power, Real Estate Edition. Right now it's 5 to 11, and time for the latest news from the WNYC newsroom with Richard Hake. Richard, what's happening?
Hi, Brian. Thanks. Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl told a military judge he's pleading guilty to desertion and misbehavior before the enemy. His lawyer says the prosecution and defense have not agreed to a stipulation of facts in the case, which is an indication that they did not reach a deal to limit his punishment. Bergdahl is charged with endangering his fellow soldiers by walking away from a remote post in Afghanistan in 2009. President Trump's third travel ban is set to take effect on Wednesday, and some civil rights and Muslim advocacy groups organized a prayer vigil last night in Lower Manhattan to oppose it. Nathan Lee said as a Jewish American, he's particularly troubled by it.
History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, and I see what's happening right now as rhyming an awful lot with the 30s.
And a handful of Donald Trump supporters turned out. Karen Brown pushed back against the protesters' claim that it's a Muslim ban.
We don't have a proper way to vet people, so we have to put restrictions on them. And it's not a total restriction. They can still come here if there are extenuating circumstances.
Like previous versions, the new ban blocks U.S. travel from 6 Muslim-majority countries, with new restrictions on North Koreans and certain Venezuelan government officials. A new state audit finds New York City has no official procedure in place to determine how much to pay homeless shelter providers. The New York Times reports that funding agreements have largely gone uncontested by the Department of Homeless Services, with shelter providers naming their own prices and little further negotiation. The city, which shelters approximately 58,000 homeless people a day, has been paying over $1.1 billion to shelter providers every year. And New York City's government is putting the final touches on its pitch to bring Amazon here in a big way. WNYC's Ilya Maritz has that.
Amazon wants to build a second North American headquarters. That could mean billions of dollars in investment and lots of new jobs. So cities from Toronto to San Diego are competing to get noticed. Attracting attention isn't usually a problem for New York. Finding open land and getting anything built is. City Hall asked businesses and landlords to share their ideas for working with Amazon. More than 40 of them responded. The city won't say what locations made it into its proposal or what other goodies might be on offer. Pitches are due to Amazon no later than this Thursday.
And this morning, some civic groups are planning to rally to oppose taxpayer subsidies of Amazon. That's at City Hall. And the Yankees are looking to break the Houston Astros 2-0 series winning streak when they face off for a third time tonight. The Astros won both of the first 2 games of the American League Championship Series, but Yankees outfielder Aaron Judge says his team is looking to turn things around.
We've been facing some tough pitchers, some tough games, and this is a team that battles. We're not going to give up, so we're just going to keep going out there and keep fighting.
And in honor of the series, the MTA is running the Nostalgia Train. It's a vintage subway train dating back to 1917. Fans can catch this train at Grand Central up to Yankee Stadium for the game tonight. The winner of the Best of 7 series will advance to the World Series. Well, we should see some sun later today, near steady temperatures around 60 degrees. It does get chilly tonight with lows in the 40s, and sun tomorrow with highs again near 60 degrees. That's the latest from the WNYC Newsroom. I'm Richard Hake.
As part of our voting block project, people from all over New Jersey have sent WNYC questions that they'd like to ask the candidates for governor.
What things are you prepared to cut to get us back on a financially stable future?
Will you work for single-payer health care?
How would you deal with the heroin epidemic?
And we intend to get answers. Send us your questions at wnyc.org/askthecandidates.
WNYC is supported by Riverside Memorial Chapel, for generations a symbol of Jewish tradition. More info about arranging or pre-arranging funeral services available at 212-362-6600 or riversidememorialchapel.com. The Charles H. Repson Foundation, because a great city needs an informed and engaged public. More information at repsonfoundation.org. Amazon Studios and Roadside Attractions presenting Wonderstruck from Todd Haynes, the director of Carol and Far From Heaven, starring Julianne Moore and Michelle Williams, based on the novel by Brian Selznick, in theaters October 20th. Join New York Public Radio's Community Advisory Board for a conversation with On the Media host Brooke Gladstone, Wednesday, October 18th at 6:30 p.m. in the Green Space. Details at 646-829-4000 or wnyc.org/cab.
And this is WNYC FM HD and AM New York, WNJT FM 88.1 Trenton, WNJP 88.5 Sussex, WNJY 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. We are live in the Green Space today, and now we get to do something really fun in a geeky sort of way, but also really important. We're going to have an old-fashioned Oxford-style debate with the help of the group that does this all the time, Intelligence Squared US, or IQ2 US. The question in this debate is likely the most important thing New Yorkers will be deciding on Election Day, and chances are most of you New Yorkers listening right now don't even know about it. It's a question on the ballot in all of New York State that invites you to vote for or against a New York State constitutional convention. Now, before we meet our debaters, just a little bit of background. You know that the United States government has a constitution, right? Well, state governments have constitutions too. The New York State Constitution has all kinds of things in it. One of those things is that it requires this vote every 20 years. That is, it gives voters a chance to reopen the Constitution itself with a majority yes vote on Election Day. I'll mostly let the debaters frame the issues, but I will say this, which will be relevant, I think, in mostly progressive downstate New York, where most of our listeners are. Progressives are divided on whether to have a constitutional convention. Some see the opportunity to expand constitutional rights in the state for women and people of color, for poor people, for marijuana smokers, and for the people generally against corruption. Others are afraid that conservatives will dominate the constitutional protections, dominate the convention, I should say, and the constitutional protections considered progressive will be weakened or in some cases taken away. Pension rights, gun safety laws, environmental protections, and more. And so we've set up our panel largely to debate whether a New York State constitutional convention will be good or bad for progressive policies and values. Our official debate question is simple and straightforward. Yes or no to this statement. Vote yes to call a New York State constitutional convention. Yes or no to voting yes. And I'm standing right now between two teams of two, for those of you who can't see us. And by the way, if you're listening and you would like to see us, when we're in the green space like this, we live video stream the show. So if you want to go to thegreenspace.org, that's green with an E at the end, thegreenspace.org. You can find the live video stream, and I'll wave hello to everybody out there in video land as well as people who are listening on the radio. So the rest of you cannot see that I'm standing between two teams of two, experts in the topic who will argue for and against the motion, vote yes to call a New York State Constitutional Convention. This Oxford-style debate will go in 3 rounds. And then you, our audience, listening, watching on the live video stream and here live in the green space, will choose the winner. And listeners, here's how it works for you. We will invite you to cast a vote right now to state your starting point before the debate. Then you can cast a second vote after the debate. That way we'll see which team of debaters changed more minds, and it might be an indication of who's got the more work to do between now and Election Day. So let's get to the first round of voting. To cast your pre-debate vote, type the website address iq2us.org/vote into any web browser. You will get a list of options for the motion, against the motion, and undecided. Undecided is also an option at iq2us.org/vote. IQ for Intelligence Squared, our debating partners. The number 2, US as in United States, .org/vote. iq2us.org/vote. iq2us.org/vote. And you will get a list of options for the motion, against the motion, and undecided on the motion for whether to have a New York State Constitutional Convention. Vote right now. It's non-binding, obviously. In fact, that's the whole point. You just register how you think you feel about this right at this moment, and at the end of the debate, you get to vote again. So cast your pre-debate vote, yes or no, to a New York State Constitutional Convention at iq2us.org/vote, iq2us.org/vote. Our motion, vote yes to call the New York State Constitutional Convention. Let's meet the debaters. First, the team arguing for the motion, Gerald Benjamin, distinguished professor at SUNY New Paltz and co-editor of the book, New York's Broken Constitution, The Governance Crisis and the Path to Renewed Greatness, and New York State Senator Liz Krueger, Democrat from the east side of Manhattan. And the team arguing against the Constitutional Convention, Adrian Holder, attorney in charge of the civil practice of the Legal Aid Society, and Henry Garrido, who is the executive director of DC Council 37. That's the big municipal employees union. Listeners and people in the Green Space audience, please welcome our debaters. All right. Thank you very much. And on to round one, opening statements from each of our debaters. They will be 4 minutes each. And we start with Gerald Benjamin up first for the motion. Gerald Benjamin, distinguished professor of political science at SUNY New Paltz. Professor.
Good morning. I urge you to vote yes for a constitutional convention. Governance in New York State is in crisis. This crisis has many dimensions, some obvious, others less evident. Our peak political institutions are massively dysfunctional and out of balance with each other. The state legislature is dominated by leadership and fails to function as a deliberative body. It is riven with corruption, peopled by unaccountable members elected from gerrymandered districts, opaque in its operations, and often unable to decide key matters because of bicameral differences. Partly as a result of informal constitutional change through high court misinterpretation or pragmatic acceptance of the governor's budgetary powers and powers to define the legislative agenda through what's called messages of necessity, the executive power has grown beyond intention, beyond dimensions desirable for a democratic republic. Without constitutional grounding, our Attorney General seeks to be the state's chief prosecutor, responding to popular demand for cleaning up the system at any cost, even at the cost of the creation of a non-democratic praetorian government. Our elections are administered by constitutionally entrenched partisan process, disguised as bipartisan, an example of reform captured by machine politics. More than almost anywhere in the United States, people in New York don't vote, abetting developments that threaten to transform them from citizens to subjects of the regime. Justice delayed is justice denied. Ask any lawyer. Our judicial system, the subject of 30% of our 50,000-word Constitution, and entirely defined in it, is the least well-organized in the country and routinely delays justice, especially in civil matters. After a century-long struggle, we embraced the idea of home rule for localities in our Constitution, but have not in fact achieved it. This should be very evident to people in New York City. Again, with the support of the High Court, the state government regularly inserts itself into local matters. More generally, our lengthy Constitution is replete with dead-letter law. It needs a good scrubbing. All these problems, in whole or in part, require constitutional remedies. The convention is a once-in-a-generation opportunity given us in 1846 by Constitution writers to bypass entrenched power, return to the democracy's sovereign people, you and me, the sovereign people, to make needed reforms that the legislature will not make. We must seize this opportunity. Look at this Constitution. I imagine not many people here have read it. It's the size of a paperback novel. One reason for its length, admittedly excessive, is that in several ways state constitutions have different functions than our national constitution. One difference is they entrench positive rights, not restrictions, but requirements placed on government. Over decades, constitutions in New York have routinely directed government to do such things as provide education, establish your civil service system, protect our wilderness against depredation, assure worker rights to organize, and guarantee their pensions as contracts, and to respond to the needs of the poor. These are all good ideas. I embrace them. However, it is an ironic unintended consequence that many of those who rightly value these provisions now want to deny the state the opportunity to address its governance crisis for fear that they will be compromised or lost. Often with partial truths or misrepresentations of the historic record, opponents attack constitutionally defined processes for calling and staffing a convention. These processes are far from perfect, but as my colleague will tell you, efforts to change them have failed because the legislature does not want a convention. It does not want to be bypassed. It does not want reform.
20 seconds.
Now, there are other matters that we'll get into in some detail, but the fundamental point is that there's no way to reform New York government, the fundamentals of New York government, without holding a constitutional convention. That's why I urge you to join me in voting yes for a convention in November.
Thank you, Professor Benjamin. Our next debater against the motion, vote yes to call a New York State Constitutional Convention, is Adrienne Holder, attorney in charge of the civil practice of the Legal Aid Society.
Thank you. Good morning. I stand very proud with so many other progressive organizations who are asking you all to really look at the facts and to vote no against a constitutional convention. At the Legal Aid Society, we represent individuals and families in the community in over 300,000 matters a year. We do that with a high-volume direct legal services practice, as well as through class action and impact litigation. We engage in legislative and policy advocacy and community outreach and education, and I think that we're uniquely qualified to tell you that a constitutional convention really poses some serious and grave risks. Grave risks to low-income persons, people of color, LGBT New Yorkers, women, children, the elderly, and immigrants. All constituencies that are being targeted by Washington, D.C. right now. All constituencies, quite frankly, that many legislators here in the state have never prioritized. And so we have friends, and I really respect Liz Krueger. I've known her many, many years, Senator Krueger. I've known her many, many years. And I respect folks who are saying, some of our friends who are saying, this is the time, isn't it, Adrienne, to go ahead and have a constitutional convention. Let's go ahead and push for real reforms. And I say, we are always about reforms. We're the Legal Aid Society. We're the oldest and largest private non-for-profit defender organization, civil legal services organization in the country. But this is not the way to do it. Good idea, wrong roadmap. What we're really talking about is that if we have a constitutional convention, everything is up for grabs. Everything. And quite specifically, and what we focus on, is a provision in the state constitution, Article 17, Section 1, that mandates that the state provide aid and care to the needy. And it's through this provision that we've been able to secure some tremendous rights for folks, protections, expansion and protections. And quite literally, what are those? Some of those have to do with the court having established that New York City will not abide by having homeless individuals and families sleep out on the street. There's a right to shelter in New York because we, the Legal Aid Society, brought that legislation and provided that advocacy. Every day, my lawyers who work in preventing evictions and homelessness, they're able to do that with programs and subsidies that were established in response to litigation that we brought because of Article 17. The state constitution provided that type of safety net and strengthened that safety net. And all across this country, there are states that time limit people's benefits. There are states that actually will deprive children of subsistence benefits. Needy children of subsistence benefits because it's thought that their parents have not complied with any work rules. And we can go to court if something is going on and they're denied those benefits. We would need an ironclad guarantee. We would have to know that through this process of electing 204 delegates, that we know that there are going to be folks who are going to protect these rights. We know since the 90s there's actually been legislation introduced to actually eliminate or weaken Article 17. And as lawyers, we're trained to look at the risk and look at the rewards. And I'm telling you, there's a lot at stake. And the competing interests and the fact that our clients' issues oftentimes are not the priority, we know that with horse trading, we have no reason to think that this would in any way favor our clients. The risk is too great.
20 seconds.
Meanwhile, there's an alternative. New Yorkers have amended the Constitution over 200 times by legislative amendment. Legislative amendment bears none of the same risks as a convention. Single changes are voted up and down, others are not at stake, and in fact there are two that are going to be on the ballot in November. For these reasons, the Legal Aid Society stands with the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, and the NAACP and unions, and so many other progressive organizations with a proven track record protecting and expanding the rights of individuals.
Thank you very much. Ms. Holder from the Legal Aid Society. Debating for the motion, vote yes to call a New York State Constitutional Convention, New York State Senator Liz Krueger, Democrat from the Upper East Side. Hi.
Hi, Brian. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. And I just want to start by saying I respect all four of the debaters here today. And this is actually a debate within the progressive community, because I proudly define myself as a liberal Democrat, a progressive who wants to make the state better. And yet, I have seen over the 15 years I have been in the legislature that the right answer, I believe, is a constitutional convention. I opposed the convention in '97 for some of the exact reasons that Adrian spoke of, because I was doing anti-poverty work then. But I've watched 20 years where we've actually gone backwards in protecting the needs of the lowest income New Yorkers. We've gone backwards in any number of issues that matter more than ever, because it is the 21st century. We can't depend on Washington. We have to figure out how to do the right things for ourselves in New York. But our constitutional structure is outdated, antiquated, and doesn't allow for true democracy. I trust the people of New York. They're going to get 3 bites at the apple to get this right, or stop it if it's wrong. The election right coming up in November, whether or not we vote yes or no on the ballot initiative, then a determination of delegates who will run in 2018, which is going to be a hot-button year, I believe, for progressives to make their moves in politics, given all of the excitement around the need to make changes in our government and political process. And then finally, the voters again will get to decide whether or not they accept the final proposal of the delegates. And guess what? Every time we've had a convention in this state, and it has actually passed the voters, it has been a movement forward in progressive agenda issues, not the taking away of rights. So I hear people talking about their fears that we could go backwards, but I would argue that the majority of New Yorkers would not let that happen. I hear from my friends in the environmental movement, we could lose forever wild protecting our parks. I point out in the 21st century, we can get an amendment to the Constitution within a constitutional convention to provide for clean air, clean water, which other states have through their process, but we do not have here. I hear Legal Aid Society's concern about we could lose that one sentence. I don't believe it. I actually think we could expand protections and discrimination against different peoples, which the existing Constitution continues to allow to take place. Get campaign finance reform and voter reform, which are the fundamental failures of the state legislature, because the truth is, those of us who are in office think it's working just fine for us. But it's not working fine for 20 million New Yorkers. So we can get the changes we need in the infrastructure of the government process in the 21st century that ensure we can move forward with more equitable and fair legislation moving through a legislature who would have to abide by the rules they have no intention of passing on themselves, but the people could pass on as requirements through a convention. So I urge everyone to seriously ask themselves, do they think the structure in Albany is working for them? Do we think that it is a fair and equitable system? We can't get criminal court reform. We can't get court reform. We can't get campaign finance reform, legislative reform. We do pretend ethics reforms I think, every year, and then somebody else gets sentenced to jail and we go, oops, we got that wrong again.
15 seconds.
We have a real opportunity to function as democracy was designed to do, open it up to the people, have the hard discussions, make the proposals, and then see whether the public votes up or down. There is plenty of opportunity for public process for this to go forward successfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Krueger. Our final debater is against the motion. As if you're just joining us, we're going 2 and 2 in these 4-minute opening statements. Then we'll have a big discussion. We'll invite your phone calls, audience questions from here in the green space. So our final debater against the motion, vote yes on Election Day to call a New York State Constitutional Convention, is Henry Garrido. He's Executive Director of the largest New York City employees union, DC 37. Mr. Garrido.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. We are urging you to vote no on a constitutional convention. I think I have heard arguments from friends in the progressive movement about how this will become the mechanism to change what is broken in Albany. It has been painted as a panacea where everything that we seem to be against will be done through the Constitutional Convention. I simply believe, and the people I represent have shown me that there's just simply too much at stake. That we have provisions in the constitutions that would affect the environment in the Forever Wild provision, that there's merit and fitness requirements as protected in the Constitution with the civil service, that you are putting people's retirement security at risk by allowing the influence of Wall Street and other institutions who have been trying to get holds of public pensions for many, many years, that will have an opportunity to do that. There are provisions in the constitutions that are too costly, and I believe it's naive to think that we're going to be able to change what is broken in Albany to this process. And quite frankly, for those who have painted this as the People's Convention, the reality is the agenda for this convention would be set by the 204 delegates that would be elected to the 63 senatorial districts and the 15 delegates at large. And we have seen the influence of money in the elections throughout this nation, especially since Citizens United, where we have seen people like the Koch brothers buy elections processes. We believe that the average New Yorker, the school aide out in Queens, will not be able to run as a delegate. And in fact, it would be the influence of money that would be dominating the selection process of the delegates. There is simply too much at risk to allow for a process. In fact, it is our belief that you are putting the same people that you have had concerns in Albany and concerns in the state of New York in charge of a process that would put together all that is precious to us. In the last Constitutional Convention that we saw in 1967, exactly that happened, where bundling was a process where good things were put with bad things together, and voters were asked to vote up and down whether they should approve the good things or the bad things. Look, are there things in the constitutions that we need to change? Yes. Are there things there that we could do better? Absolutely. But a constitutional convention is not the way to do it. In fact, I think Adrian mentioned the fact that the Constitution has been changed over 200 times through a process that already exists. And we believe if people feel strongly enough that they need to change some of the things that should be done, not through the Constitutional Convention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes round one of this debate in partnership with Intelligence Squared US. Please thank all four of our debaters for making their initial presentations. And people here in the Green Space audience and anybody listening or watching out there in radio and live video streaming land, keep in mind how you voted at the start of this debate. Those of you who voted, you will be voting again at the conclusion in about a half hour. It's the difference between the first vote and the second vote that determines our winner and might make a little news here today. We will have round 2, a panel discussion among the 4 debaters, where I will follow up on some of the things that they all raised, and you can too. Coming up after a break, call in, listeners, with a question for any of the 4 debaters on what you heard about reasons to vote for or against a New York State Constitutional Convention. 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. All of that right after this.
The hidden costs of the emergency room.
They're secret. You know, you're not going to see these posted on the emergency room door. You're just going to find out what your hospital's facility fee is for the emergency room when you get the bill and when you're expected to pay it.
When a quick trip to the ER runs you a steep bill, including the story of the $629 Band-Aid. That's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
WNYC supporters include the Guggenheim Museum, presenting Art in China after 1989, Theater of the World, a survey of contemporary art from China featuring works by 71 artists. More information and tickets at guggenheim.org/artinchina. The Jerome L. Green Foundation, helping to keep the arts affordable and accessible for audiences across New York City. On the next On Being.
I think what we're seeing actually is not compassion fatigue, but empathic distress.
Zen abbot and anthropologist Joan Halifax on finding buoyancy rather than burnout in our lives and in the world. I'm Krista Tippett. Please join us. Tonight at 9 on 93.9 FM WNYC.
Lehrer on WNYC, live in the green space today. And if you're just joining us, we're in the middle of a real old-fashioned Oxford-style debate on a really important ballot question that New York State voters will decide upon on Election Day. Should there be a New York State Constitutional Convention? Voters decide this every 20 years, only every 20 years. And we're asking, would opening up the state constitution be more of an opportunity for progressives or conservatives to have their way with the New York State Constitution? We have 2 teams of people on each side debating the formal motion, which is vote yes to call a New York State Constitutional Convention, and the kind of more informal subtext here, is this going to be good or bad for progressives and progressive values and the people with interests who are represented by progressive values, because that's really where the debate seems to be falling in New York State. This is very largely progressive on progressive here with different camps. And on the side for the motion, we have Gerald Benjamin and Liz Kruger. On the side against the motion, Adrian Holder and Henry Garrido. Mr. Garrido is Executive Director of the Municipal Employees Union, DC 37. Ms. Holder, also against the motion, is with the Legal Aid Society. Gerald Benjamin is a professor at New Paltz who wrote a book on the messed up New York State Constitution, and Progressive Democrat Liz Kruger from the east side of Manhattan is our other for the motion side. So again, now we do a panel discussion, and you can each designate on your teams who's going to speak. What I want to throw out first as a follow-up is a pure politics question, because it sounds like you agree on the values. You want protection for the poor, for women, for LGBTQ folks, for people of color, for the environment, et cetera. So, Liz Kruger, I guess we could start with you. Why think that the energized, Trumpy, conservative nationalists aren't going to hijack this convention and give us some right-wing changes rather than progressive changes?
So the energized Trumpy nationalists, the good news is they don't really represent a large bloc in any given Senate district in the state. So it is true there will be 204 delegates. Other than 15 of them, they will be voted 3 per Senate district.
So now we're getting into another important aspect.
Right.
How do we choose the delegates to a constitutional convention if one is approved? So repeat that formula.
Okay, so there'll be 204 delegates, 15 of which are voted at large statewide. The others are elected 3 per Senate district. There are only 31 Republican senators in the entire state. So hypothetically,
There are only 32 Democratic senators in the entire state, right?
correct, but Democrats outnumber Republicans in registration 2-1. So the truth is, when you look at delegates running per district, there's far more of a chance of Democrats winning the delegate slots than Republicans. And while, yes, it's true, a legislator could run for delegate at the same time as they were running for re-election in 2018, personally, I think most of us would have a hard time explaining to the voters why we want them to vote for us for 2 different jobs where we're going to get paid our salary twice, so that we can be a delegate in a legislature. I think most legislators won't go near trying to be delegates this time
this
around.
is optimism versus pessimism, right?
Well, I thank the senator for proving my point. The reality is that it doesn't matter how many registered voters you have, either Democrat or Republican. The reality is the majority of the people who get elected get reelected over and over again because of voter apathy, because of low turnout, because they already have an inside track on the registered voters in that particular district. What we have seen and we're afraid of is not only existing senators, with all respect, Senator, to run, but also running slates so that they could also carry in some of their own groups in their district and they can, in fact, manipulate the process. Electing the delegates is a real issue and a real concern because they could open any portion of the Constitution, not just what we want to see, but what the delegates have to see. And until we have a process that's fair, that allows for everyday New Yorkers to run, I don't think that would be a good process to follow.
And if I could just add, in addition, when you're thinking about these Senate districts, these are districts that we all agree that more so than the assembly districts, they actually have been gerrymandered. And so the idea that we're actually going to open it up and it's going to be this event where we're going to really have a very open and we're going to be able to encourage a lot of different folks to participate in the process. That premise is just wrong. 20 years ago, we should have really been trying to change the delegate rules, and we should have been doing some things around voter reforms with voting here in the state. I sat on a committee at the state bar where we came up with wonderful suggestions about how to reform and to really open it up for the state so that we don't have to continue to be number 46 in terms of voter participation. And again, there's a whole process that we can go through. But even that, there's a level of confusion and apathy about how it is that we're going to get voters, and some of that has to happen. It's putting the cart before the horse to think that all of a sudden we're going to have.
I think it's the opposite because we didn't. Because you left that to the legislature, it didn't happen, and it's not going to happen unless you have a constitutional
Let me stay on
convention.
Professor Benjamin, let me stay on this question of the delegates for one more second, because if there are 63 state Senate districts, and it's going to be 3 per state Senate districts elected by the people in each district, then we're talking about a coin toss, whether the liberals or conservatives come out in control of the convention, aren't we?
That's not true. That's not true. Let's correct the record a little bit. First of all, Liz Kruger and others put process changes in, and they weren't passed. I call this the catch-22. The legislature won't pass the process changes because it doesn't want a convention. Then after it fails to do that, it argues to you, oh, look how awful the process is, don't do this. In fact, we have to authorize a convention so that process changes occur. The way that will happen is, and I know this because I debated the head of the New York Civil Liberties Union, they'll immediately bring a lawsuit, and the lawsuit will drive process changes. So that's the question of process change. The question of the districts is interesting. It's a Republican gerrymander for the Senate, and I might add a massive Democrat gerrymander for the Assembly. The Assembly is not virtuous when it comes to gerrymandering. So now we have a Republican gerrymander that's produced a Democrat majority in the Senate. And the reason is that the Republicans can't gerrymander themselves into control because there aren't enough Republicans in New York. And if you look at the way they did it, they cut very close margins in certain districts and relied on incumbency and packed the Democrats in other districts. But we're electing 3 in each of these districts. They will not be able to elect 3. Democrats will be elected in some of those districts by divided outcomes, as occurred in 1967. So the net, any serious an analyst of this, and there have been several, I've done some of this and others have, say there'll be at least 110, and perhaps as many as 125 Democrats at the convention. I gain no comfort from this as an upstater, but that happens to be the fact. So to argue that the outcome is going to be conservative, why most thoughtful conservatives in New York, and again, I am not proud of this, have condemned the prospect of a convention because they think that precisely the opposite will happen. Liberal Democrats will run the convention.
Let me tell our callers that we'll go to phone calls in just a minute, and people here in the green space, raise your hand, and Zoe, who is somewhere I can't see, will come around with a microphone and we'll take your questions from here. Let me follow up with you, Mr. Grito, on one thing. We're talking about whether progressive values or conservative values might rule the day at a state constitutional convention. Unions are generally seen as on the progressive side. But in this context, are the municipal union like yours and the other public employees unions who are working very hard to defeat a constitutional convention, from what I've read, more money is coming from the teachers union than from any other single source on either side, and the unions are really fighting this. Why should we not see you as a special interest rather than a progressive in this case, trying to keep it as hard as it is today for the public to make changes to the pension system if they think the state can't afford it?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I said that I make no apologies for fighting for and protecting working people. There's a lot of pieces in this Constitution that will affect not just union people, but working people in general. There are workers' compensation laws, worker protections, there's collective bargaining laws that affect not just represented by a union in the public sector, but in the private sector as well. And as far as the issue of pension, yes, we are concerned about changes in the Constitution that would diminish the retirement security of literally millions of people here in New York, not just those who are in the union. You know, people talk about...
It's only public employee unions who can be directly affected by changes to the state constitution in this respect, right?
Well, no, that's actually not true. In terms of pensions, there is, but there's also prevailing wage laws, and those are wages that are protected. That affects both public and private employees in the Constitution. And there's a real serious fear among both public and private sector unions that if they change the way the public sector pensions are done in terms of defined benefit contributions, that it will affect the private sector as well. So yes, there are many protections in the constitutions that help working people, including many of those who don't work anymore, who are retirees, whose average pension, by the way, is $18,000 a year in New York. And we're very concerned about changing the constitutions and taking away those protections.
Let's go to a phone caller. Kelly in Bedford-Stuyvesant, you're on WNYC. Hi, Kelly.
Hi there. My question is for hopefully both sides of the panel, and it's regarding the voter laws that we have here in New York, which are among the most draconian and unprogressive in the entire country. And my question is, if we don't change some of these backwards voter laws in the Constitutional Convention, what is the reality that they will ever be changed by a normal legislative process? Because I personally don't have confidence that they will ever change if we go through the normal channels.
That sounds like a challenge to the con side, primarily. So, Ms. Holder, you want to take that?
I mean, I think that, again, when we talk about all of the energy that we've been expending, I think in the last many, many months, to actually talk about all of the changes that need to happen. I think it's a very good question that you raise, and I think we're all very concerned with what we need to have in terms of real reforms, especially when it comes to voting. And I think what we should do is we should band together, that we need to talk about what those reforms can be, and we need to push those through. But again, the idea that we would open up the entire Constitution in order to deal with these types of issues, I think it just is, it poses some really grave and serious risks to so many other protections that Henry and I are talking about. And so, yes, we need to reform the laws. I think a lot of states have reformed a lot of their laws. I think the energy, and I like the energy. I love the fact that this is a progressive debate. I like the fact that there are people who are really interested in talking about these issues, and we live in a great state. We live in an exceptional state, and we right now are in a great city where we could get those things done, but we have to be very real, and we need to prioritize what it is that we're talking about. And the things that I have raised, I think, are the types of things that with horse trading, they are not going to be the priority. They're going to fall off the table. But yes, we do need much needed reforms.
Let me suggest a quotation from Albert Einstein. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. We've been pressing in the legislature for these reforms for literally decades. The Constitution directs that elections will be administered by boards of elections. We know that that's a waste of money. We know that they run elections unfairly. We know that we should have neutral election administration. Additionally, the Constitution has certain rules about registration in anticipation of the election. We know that those rules need to be changed to elevate participation. That is not happening. When the federal government funded reform in elections following the contested presidential election of year 2000, if I have my memory correct, New York State ran a special report on how it would reform its election as required by the feds. They did not attempt to address this process. And the reason they didn't is because it's entrenched and in the interest of incumbents to sustain this process. We need a constitutional convention to address the fundamental governance issues. We have massive experience that they're not addressed in the normal process of governance. We need to create a new institution with new players, no incumbents in those positions. They exist for only one purpose: to give consideration to the fundamentals of our governance. They respond to the sovereign people who select them for a special purpose. We need this opportunity.
We have a question here, excuse me, in the green space, and we thank Brian Lehrer Show producers Amina Cerna and Zoe Agelet for running with the mics during the green space program this morning. Hi there.
Hi, this feels like a risky question to ask, but I'm noticing that the teams are balanced in terms of gender, but the pro side are white and the no side are people of color, and I wonder if that means anything, and is that just a coincidence, or does that mean something in terms of what's going on in the debate?
I have no idea. Mr. Guido, what do you think?
No, I do think it's a coincidence. This hasn't been broken around the issue of race, but more of progressive values. Now, I do think that what was raised about this concept of the definition of insanity, it's true. Allowing this constitutional convention, it is exactly that. It's an insanity. You're putting the very incumbents that are running government right now and giving them the opportunity to run again as delegates, run their people as delegates, get a second salary while serving in the legislature. And then you think they're going to go on there and change the process for election? That is insane, right? That is insane. Now, to me, the Constitution already has protections against gerrymandering. Guess what? It happens. It happens because those who are in charge in Albany are allowing it to happen. And we're going to put them again in charge of our Constitution? Right. I think that's incredible.
Let me take the audience member's question a step further and ask, I'm just curious, if there is socioeconomic diversity on both sides of this, can you display it through your endorsements, through what groups are lining up for this? Because maybe what the audience member had in mind is this sort of white, middle class, abstract, good government theory types trying to push this, and a lot of women and minorities and sexual minorities afraid, because New York does have a pretty good constitution in many respects that serve them, that there's more risk than opportunity here. Who can you represent on the pro side, socioeconomic diversity in your coalition?
I absolutely think so. I think it, with all due respect, is overly simplistic. There happens to be 4 of us here, and we got gender down in 4 people, but we didn't get the race mix down. We're a big diverse city and state, so I do not think this falls into, a race or necessarily economic breakout. I do just want to respond, though, to Henry's point that it would be insanity to elect delegates. Well, if you don't have a constitutional convention, guess what? Those of us who are in the legislature and the special interests who have been in control of all these things that New Yorkers are frustrated with will just keep doing what we've been doing. If you have an election of delegates, you end up with 204. Even if we even if all the senators got in again, and they wouldn't, you still have a real opportunity for real people who are not part of the special interest controlled or owned process that is the New York State legislative and gubernatorial system to now have a chance at making it better. So I think it's what it does. It's driven by fear of the what if versus willingness to take the risk that we can get much better. Now, does that break down socioeconomically? I don't know, Brian. You need a sociologist.
I actually disagree. So I disagree with both. So I actually do think that this does break down. I know as unpopular as that might actually be for a soundbite for some people, I think it actually does break down. And so what you're seeing, I think, is real. Again, I want to emphasize, there have been attempts to weaken Article 17. The actual idea that there's a mandate for the care, to provide aid and care to the needy, I think that's real. And the fact of the matter is that our clients, people of color, low-income individuals, working class folks who actually are trying to make ends meet, people who are trying to hold on to their pensions, it's a real issue when we have what's going on in our government right now, is the idea that, I mean, when you even look at what happened in Wisconsin, there are real issues around right to work laws and everything else. To think that we could believe that people of color, that women, that immigrants are going to get a fair shake in this process, I just really think it is naive.
By the way.
So I would say that in terms of what you're seeing in terms of the breakdown, yes, my clients, all low-income New Yorkers, either involved in the criminal justice system, in the family court system as children and vulnerable teenagers, or through civil legal services, provision of services that we provide, yes, they are extremely at risk. And when we look at what happened at the election this year, we're still looking at what kind of moneyed interest actually had an influence on our election. Yes, I believe in our democracy. Yes, I believe in the diversity, that we have strength here. But for us to think that we can go blindly without any other protections in place, and that we're going to get diverse delegates that are going to come through and represent all those interests, I think it is a bit naive.
We have 1 minute left in this round. Gerald Benjamin, you'll get the last word in this round, if you want to respond to that.
What the legislature and their friends say is, watch out, we'll get elected and we'll do nothing. Don't do this. Why don't they want to do this? Why is the majority leader against it? Why is the speaker against it? Why is the minority leader in the Senate against it? They don't want it because they'll be bypassed, and if bypassed, likely to good things will happen. Pensions are protected by the U.S. Constitution. The argument's been overmade. Pensions can't be diminished. Current holders will not have their pensions diminished. This simple fact grounded in law. The arguments are being exaggerated to block a path to reforming New York government. The only available path to reforming New York government is being beaten down by the real money in this election, which is the union money. There's no right-wing money in this election. Look at the filings. It's a myth invented to scare you as you go in to vote.
Now, for the record, since it came up, Article 17 of the New York State Constitution is called social welfare. And I'll just read Section 1, which is short. The aid, care, and support of the needy are public concerns and shall be provided by the state and by such of its subdivisions and in such manner and by such means as the legislature may from time to time determine. So Article 17, social welfare, in the Constitution currently is in play here. And now we go to round 3, which is to get to hear brief closing statements from each debater. They will be 1 minute each. Remember, for the audience listening right now who voted before the debate, this is your last chance to decide how to vote in your post-debate vote, which we will get in before the end of the show, so we'll have instant results from the web. And debaters, this is your last chance for you to change their minds. And the order as I have it actually has us continuing with Gerald Benjamin. Right now, you get the first 1 minute closing statement.
Are you happy with a state government that interferes with New York governance and doesn't allow you to govern yourselves? Are you happy with a state legislature that has pandemic corruption with no ethics standard? Are you happy with a governor that's over-powerful and is trying to govern without representative democracy? Are you happy with an election system that keeps people from voting and is presumptively corrupt with a small c in its operation? If you're happy with all those things, then I say vote against the convention. if you're concerned about those things, I would urge you to join me in voting yes for a convention. It will be the only path in this generation to make serious reform in New York government. It will be the only path available to you in this generation to restore the greatness of our state, the greatness that I learned about when I had to memorize all the bridges and tunnels in the second grade in 1952 in Brooklyn.
And that didn't include the new Tappan Zee Bridge. So, against the motion, 1 minute closing statement from Adrian Holder, attorney in charge of civil practice of the Legal Aid Society.
I hope by now you all understand what we actually believe is at risk. And right now I hope that you will continue to think about the real facts of what it is that could easily happen, a complete rewriting of the Constitution and a gutting of so many of the protections that actually look out for low-income New Yorkers, the protections that assist low-wage workers as well as unionized workers through the public union system. We're talking about protections for immigrants. We're talking about protections for children and women and LGBT New Yorkers, and we stand to lose a lot. I also hope that you would be encouraged, though, that because of this debate and because of this discussion that we're having, that there are progressive values, values that we hold dear as New Yorkers that we can build upon, and hopefully we will use that as an opportunity to try to vote out certain folks that we might think are preventing us from getting the things that we need for Albany to function. But I think it is naive and really to look at what has happened in this last election that we still don't really understand all the forces that we're facing. It's naive for us to think. Please join us, other organizations that have been able to move for real change, experienced organizations, and vote no. 1 minute closing argument for the motion, Democratic State Senator Liz Krueger of Manhattan.
Thank you. I think if you did a laundry list of the kinds of legislation that we would all like to see changed, I bet all four of us would be almost identical in our views about what we would like to see changed. What we disagree on is how we're going to get there. There is concern on the con side that terrible things could happen and we could lose rights and protections. But in fact, the legislature, just like a convention, are susceptible to lobbying, but history suggests worst-case scenarios envisioned by opponents don't happen. Since 1846, there have been 5 constitutional conventions in New York, none of which has resulted in loss of major rights or protections. In fact, many of the aspects of our constitutional convention opponents fear we may lose were themselves added through constitutional conventions, not through the legislature. I believe we can make dramatic improvements in the process and the government of New York State through a constitutional convention. I hope you will, like me, trust in the voters of New York to make the right decisions and vote yes on November 7th.
And vote yes or no right now. Listeners who voted at the beginning of the hour, but wait one more minute for the last closing statement. I'm just getting people's voting fingers ready so people actually do it in the 2 minutes that we will allot for that. The final closing statement, 1 minute closing statement against the motion from Henry Garrido, Executive Director of the Union DC 37 representing municipal employees.
Well, make sure you vote no. I'm not afraid of constitutional convention. What I am not is easily fooled. And what I have seen many times were folks that will propose a change through a process just to do the opposite. And I believe this convention could be simply hijacked by very powerful right-wing forces, as our national election has in many instances throughout this country. I think the evidence is there. In the last convention in 1967, the mass majority of delegates were either already elected as officials or they were friends of those electeds who ran on slates. That could happen again. That will probably happen again here in New York. And there is simply just too much at risk. Not just in terms of retirement security for the people I represent, but also on the environment, on the Forever Wild provision, and everything else that we talked about in the civil liberties here. Vote no in a constitutional convention.
And that concludes our closing statements. Now it's time to learn which side won this debate. So listeners, viewers, Green Space audience members who participated, it's time to cast your second vote. If you voted at the beginning of the hour or before, go back to the website, iq2us.org/vote, iq2us.org/vote, and vote on what you think now. Voting instructions are on the screens. Select 1 if you are for the motion, for the Constitutional Convention, 2 if you are against, 3 if you are undecided, iq2us.org/vote, iq2us.org/vote. Everyone else, hold your breaths. We'll bring you the results right after this.
This is Brooke Gladstone. You rely on WNYC for the facts, right? You value the facts. You must, because you're listening now. So why not become a sustaining member? We're always here for you, and an automatic monthly contribution of any amount means you're always there for us. The fact is, we can't do it without you. So call 888-376-WNYC or go to WNYC.org and click on Donate.
Support for WNYC comes from Purchase College SUNY, presenting Paul Beatty, author of The Sellout, in a public conversation as part of the Durst Distinguished Lecture Series, October 17th at 4:30 p.m. in the Humanities Theater. More at purchase.edu. The New York City Transitional Finance Authority, which is offering future tax-secured bonds to individual investors on Monday, October 16th and Tuesday, October 17th. The preliminary official circular and more information are available through financial advisors and broker-dealers. WNYC is a media partner of the Webby Awards, honoring internet excellence in websites, film and video, advertising, mobile, podcasts, new categories for games, and more. Early entry deadline October 27th. More info at webbyawards.com.
This is WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the green space. And now the results are in. The results are on a screen here in the green space, and I think I'm going to be handed a piece of paper in a matter of microseconds. Remember, it's the difference between the first and the second votes that determines our winner. And are we waiting for it? Are they still tabulating? Oh, okay. I'm told under a minute. So that's good because we have 3 minutes left in the show. So under a minute, the math still works. Barely. Can I follow up with the con side and ask if Professor Benjamin is right that there is not a lot of conservative money going into this, that the conservative movement in New York State, including the Conservative Party, is against the Constitutional Convention, and I've read that the money flowing in seems to be pro and con progressive groups, then why wouldn't they want this if it would be good for conservatives likely to take over?
Well, I don't believe that's the case.
You don't believe
that? I believe that there's been an influence of money on both sides, and I believe, just to be fair, and I believe it's just being easier masqueraded, because there's contributions into organizations that are in the pro side that will never make it in this scenario. What the professor may be referring to is this basically the funding to organizations who have come for or against, not those who are surrogates of those organizations and the influence of money in them.
All right, we'll do some follow-up reporting on that and put it out to the... Can I ask, again, while we're waiting for the result, maybe we can get a little narrative here, a show of hands. Who here in the green space voted at all at the beginning and at the end? Okay, so maybe about 20 people. How many of you changed your minds? About 4 or 5 people changed your minds, and that indicates something. So here we go. 33% agreed with the motion, 42% were against, 25% were undecided. Those were the first results. So the team arguing for the motion, let's see, the second vote was 39% for. I see. Okay, good. The pro team gained 6 points during the course of the hour. The against team pulled 4 points. They went up from 42 to 46. So a few of the undecideds went to each category. I call this pretty much a tie, because if the pro side added 6 percentage points from the undecideds and the anti-side added 4 percentage points from the undecideds, everybody did really well at this debate. Everybody gets a trophy for participating. We thank our partners at Intelligence Squared US, and we hope we've provided a public service on this vital Election Day ballot question that so few people still even know about it. We'll continue to cover it on The Brian Lehrer Show. And thank you all for coming to the Green Space today and for listening and watching.
WNYC is supported by NYRB Classics, publisher of Elizabeth Hardwick's Book of Essays. Margot Jefferson, Darrell Pinckney, and others discuss Hardwick at the Brooklyn Public Library October 18th at 7 p.m. More at nyrb.com. Plaza Jewish Community Chapel, owned and operated by the Jewish community.